6 hours later, I was standing in the lobby of a small-town bank in Kelowna, British Columbia, watching them transfer the last of my accessible funds into an account they'd never find. Back in Calgary, my son Trevor and his wife Jessica were probably pulling into my driveway right now, expecting to walk out with a check for $375,000. Instead, they'd find an empty house, a disconnected phone number, and a single envelope taped to the front door. Inside that envelope was a letter I'd written at 2 a.m, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of whiskey I never finished. The letter explained everything. It explained nothing. It said goodbye without saying where I was going, and it contained copies of every text message, every voicemail, every email where they'd demanded, pleaded, threatened, and manipulated me over the past 8 months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where this really started. My name is Robert Chen, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 37 years as a mechanical engineer for an oil and gas company in Calgary. My wife Linda died 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and losing her nearly destroyed me. But I had reasons to keep going. I had my son Trevor, his wife Jessica, and most importantly, my 2 grandchildren, Emma, who's 9, and Connor, who's 7. Those kids were my anchor. Every Sunday, they'd come over to my house in Altadore, and we'd make pancakes together. Emma liked hers with blueberries. Connor wanted chocolate chips. I'd pretend to be annoyed when they got batter on the floor, but Linda's apron still hung on the hook by the stove, and I swear I could feel her smiling when I wore it. Trevor had always been, let's call it, financially optimistic. Even as a teenager, he'd had big plans, business ideas, investment schemes, ways to make quick money. Linda used to say he had his grandfather's entrepreneurial spirit. I just thought he'd never learned to live within his means. When he married Jessica 6 years ago, I hoped she'd be a stabilizing influence. She came from money. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships across Alberta, and I assumed she understood the value of financial planning. I was wrong. The first sign came about 3 years ago, right after Linda's funeral. Trevor showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening, looking uncomfortable. He sat in Linda's chair, the reading chair by the window, where she used to do crosswords, and asked if I could help him with a temporary cash flow problem. He needed $20,000 to cover a business loan payment. His digital marketing agency was going through a rough patch, he said, but big contracts were coming. He'd pay me back within 6 months. I wrote the check that night. What else could I do? He was my son, and Linda would have wanted me to help. 6 months later, there was another request, $35,000 this time. The agency still wasn't profitable, and they were behind on their mortgage. Jessica was pregnant with Connor, and they couldn't afford the financial stress. This loan, Trevor promised, would hold them over until the agency turned around. He showed me a spreadsheet with projected revenues. The numbers looked good. I wanted to believe him. I refinanced my house to get him the money. Then, Linda got sick. During those final months, Trevor and Jessica visited less frequently. Trevor said the agency demanded his attention. They were finally closing those big contracts. Jessica said the kids were hard to manage. I understood. Terminal illness is ugly and uncomfortable, and I didn't want Emma and Connor to remember their grandmother as a skeleton in a hospital bed. So I sat with Linda alone most days, holding her hand while she slept, pretending I wasn't terrified of the silence that would come after. 2 weeks before Linda died, she squeezed my hand and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "Robert," she whispered, her voice thin as paper, "don't let them take everything. You have to save something for yourself. Promise me." I promised. I didn't know what she meant. I thought she was talking about her jewelry or photo albums, sentimental things I might give away in grief. But Linda had always been perceptive. She'd seen patterns I'd missed. After the funeral, Trevor stopped mentioning the loans. He never brought up repayment. When I gently asked about it once, he said, "Dad, seriously? Mom just died. Can we not talk about money right now?" I felt ashamed for asking. The requests continued, but they evolved. No longer loans now, they were help or support or family taking care of family. $15,000 for private school tuition for Emma. $22,000 for a family vacation to Hawaii because the kids need stability after losing their grandmother. $43,000 because Jessica's car died and they needed something reliable and safe. $50,000 because the roof needed replacing and the furnace was failing and they couldn't afford both. I paid for everything. I paid because Trevor was my only child. I paid because Emma and Connor deserved a good life. I paid because I was alone in that big house in Altador, and saying yes to their requests was the only way I knew how to stay connected to my family. But last November, something changed. Trevor called me on a Wednesday evening. "Dad, I need to talk to you about an opportunity." His voice had that excited edge I'd learned to distrust. "Can you come over this weekend? Jessica and I want to show you something." I drove to their house in Tuscany on Saturday morning. It was one of those massive new builds, 4 bedrooms, 3-car garage, stone facade. I'd contributed $47,000 to their down payment 3 years earlier. Trevor met me at the door, tablet in hand, and ushered me into their living room. Jessica was already there, sitting on their cream-colored sectional sofa that probably cost more than my first car. She smiled at me, but her eyes were calculating. "Dad, sit down," Trevor said. "This is going to blow your mind." He opened a presentation on his tablet. For the next 45 minutes, he walked me through something called a cryptocurrency liquidity pool investment opportunity. I didn't understand most of it. There were charts showing exponential growth curves, screenshots of other people's portfolios, people who'd turned 50,000 into 3 million in 18 months. Trevor talked about blockchain technology and decentralized finance and yield farming like he was explaining how to change a tire. "The thing is," Trevor said, leaning forward, "you need a significant initial investment to really make this work. I'm talking life-changing money, Dad. The kind of returns that could set up Emma and Connor for life. College funds, first houses, their own retirement accounts before they're 30. Jessica jumped in. "Trevor's been researching this for months. He's connected with people who've already made millions. But we need to act fast. The window for this particular pool closes in 2 weeks. "How much?" I asked. Trevor glanced at Jessica. She nodded. $375,000, Trevor said. "I know that sounds like a lot, but Dad, look at the projections. In 3 years, that becomes 4 million, conservatively. And it's not just for us. This is for the whole family, for Emma and Connor. For you, too, you could finally retire properly, maybe buy that cabin you and Mom always talked about." My chest tightened. Linda and I had talked about a cabin, a small place in BC, near a lake, where we could fish and watch the seasons change. We'd never done it because she got sick, and then she was gone, and the dream felt like another thing cancer had stolen. "I don't know anything about cryptocurrency," I said carefully. "That's why you have me," Trevor said. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Dad, I've spent hundreds of hours on this. I've talked to financial advisors, blockchain experts, people who've actually done this. This isn't some scam. This is the future of finance. And I'm bringing you in on the ground floor because you're family, because Mom would want all of us to be secure." He mentioned Linda like it was casual, like her name was just another data point in his presentation. "I need to think about it," I said. Jessica's smile tightened. "Of course, but like Trevor said, we only have 2 weeks. After that, the opportunity closes, and we'd have to wait for the next cycle, which could be 6 months away. And by then, the entry requirements might be even higher." I left their house feeling dizzy. $375,000. That was most of what I had left after the refinancing. After all the previous help, after funeral expenses and living costs, I'd have maybe $60,000 remaining in savings, plus my pension. I'd be comfortable, but not secure, not cushioned against emergencies. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma and Connor. Connor had just started playing hockey. I'd bought his equipment, $400 worth. Emma was taking piano lessons. I paid for those too, $60 a week. They were good kids, sweet kids. Emma would sit with me sometimes and ask questions about Linda. "Grandpa, did Grandma really used to make cookies every Sunday?" she'd ask, and I'd tell her yes. Snickerdoodles. And Emma would lean against my shoulder and say she wished she remembered more. Didn't I owe it to them to try? Didn't I owe it to Linda's memory to make sure her grandchildren had every advantage? But something nagged at me. Something about the way Jessica had smiled. Something about how Trevor hadn't asked, he'd presented. Something about the urgency, the pressure, the invocation of Linda's name like a weapon. I spent the next week doing research. I'm an engineer. I know how to analyze systems. I read about cryptocurrency. I read about investment scams. I read about liquidity pools and rug pulls and people who'd lost their life savings to schemes that promised exponential returns. Nothing Trevor had shown me appeared in any legitimate financial publication. The experts he'd mentioned didn't have verifiable credentials. The screenshots of massive returns looked like they'd been created in Excel. On Thursday, I called Trevor. I want to speak to the financial advisor you mentioned. Get me a name and a licensed firm. There was a pause. Dad, this isn't that kind of investment. It's decentralized. There are no traditional advisors. That's the whole point. Then I need to speak to someone who's actually made money from this specific pool. Someone who can show me verified bank statements. Another pause, longer this time. Are you saying you don't trust me? I'm saying I want to be careful with $375,000. Dad, Trevor's voice went cold. This is exactly why you've been stuck in the same house for 40 years. You're too afraid to take risks. Mom understood that. She used to tell me how frustrated she got with your refusal to think bigger. Linda had never said that. Linda had been the one who'd insisted we save, who'd clipped coupons and packed lunches and made our money stretch. But I didn't argue. I just said, let me think about it more. Fine, but don't blame me when you're still working at 70 because you missed this chance. He hung up. 3 days later, Jessica called. Robert, hi. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Her voice was warm, friendly, the way it used to be before every conversation became about money. I wanted to talk to you about something that's been on my mind. Can I come over? She arrived that evening with a bottle of wine and a photo album. We sat in my living room, and she poured us each a glass. Then she opened the album. It was pictures of Linda at Trevor and Jessica's wedding, Linda holding baby Emma, Linda at Connor's first birthday party, Linda in a hospital bed smiling weakly at the camera. I miss her so much, Jessica said quietly. She was always so kind to me. She treated me like a daughter. Jessica looked at me with wet eyes. Robert, I know Trevor can come on strong sometimes. He gets that from his dad. She smiled. But everything he's trying to do, it's because Linda taught him to take care of family. She used to tell him, your father works so hard, but when I'm gone, you have to make sure he doesn't just exist. Make sure he really lives. Linda had said something like that once. I'd overheard her talking to Trevor during one of her last hospital stays. But the context had been different. She'd been telling him to spend time with me, to not let grief isolate me. She hadn't been talking about investment opportunities. This cryptocurrency thing, Jessica continued, it's not about getting rich. It's about building the kind of life Linda wanted for all of us. She used to talk about that cabin, remember? About taking Emma and Connor there in the summers, teaching them to fish like you taught Trevor. With the returns from this investment, you could actually do that. You could buy the cabin, retire early, spend real time with your grandkids before they're teenagers and too busy for you. She put her hand on mine. Linda would want you to take this chance. She'd want you to have those experiences with Emma and Connor while you still can. None of us know how much time we have left, right? She taught us that. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not breaking, cracking. Like ice on a lake you're not sure will hold your weight. Jessica was using Linda against me. She was weaponizing my dead wife's memory, twisting her words, turning her love into leverage. I'll think about it, I said, pulling my hand away. Jessica's warmth evaporated. You know what, Robert? I've tried to be patient. Trevor's tried to be patient. But honestly, we're starting to wonder if you even care about your grandchildren. Because if you did, you wouldn't hesitate to help secure their future. You're sitting on all this money that you're never going to spend. You don't travel. You don't have hobbies. You barely leave this house. What are you saving it for? You can't take it with you when you die. It's my money, I said quietly. Is it? Jessica stood up. Because from where I'm sitting, it's Linda's money too. It's the life you built together. And she would be ashamed to see you hoarding it while her grandchildren miss out on opportunities. While her son struggles to provide for his family, she'd be ashamed of how selfish you've become. She left without finishing her wine. I sat in that living room for 3 hours after she left. The house was completely silent. I looked at Linda's chair, at the kitchen where she used to make snickerdoodles, at the mantel where her urn sat next to a photo of us on our 30th anniversary. And I realized something. Linda would never be ashamed of me for protecting myself. Linda had literally used her dying breath to tell me not to let them take everything. She'd known, somehow, even in the morphine haze of terminal cancer, she'd seen what was coming. The next morning, I drove to the bank. I didn't make an appointment. I just walked in and asked to speak with someone about protecting my assets. They set me up with a financial advisor named Margaret, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I told her everything. The loans, the requests, the cryptocurrency scheme, the manipulation. I expected her to tell me I was overreacting, that family was complicated, that I should try to work it out. Instead, she pulled up my account and went very quiet. "Mr. Chen," she finally said, "in the past 3 years, you've withdrawn or transferred over $400,000 to your son's accounts. You've refinanced your home. Your savings have been depleted by 78%. If you give them this additional $375,000, you'll have almost nothing left for your own retirement or emergencies. I know. And you understand that this cryptocurrency investment is almost certainly a scam. These liquidity pools with guaranteed returns don't exist. The money will disappear, and you'll have no recourse." "I know." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Then you also know you need to say no. I've tried. They won't accept it. Then you need to make it impossible for them to continue asking." That's when she explained my options. I could set up a trust that would protect the remaining funds and distribute them on a fixed schedule for my living expenses. I could move my money to accounts they didn't know about. I could, if I wanted, essentially make myself appear asset poor while securing my actual future. Or, Margaret said carefully, you could leave. People do it more often than you'd think. They relocate, change their contact information, start over somewhere their family can't find them. I'm not saying that's what you should do, but it's an option. I thought about Emma and Connor. I thought about Sunday pancakes and hockey equipment and piano lessons. I thought about missing their graduations, their weddings, their lives. Then I thought about Jessica's face when she'd said Linda would be ashamed of me. I thought about Trevor's cold voice on the phone. I thought about how neither of them had asked about my health, my loneliness, my grief in over a year. Every conversation was about money. Every visit was a transaction. They didn't love me. They loved my bank account. And worse, they were teaching Emma and Connor that relationships were transactional, that grandparents existed to fund lifestyles, that love was measured in dollars transferred. "How long would it take to arrange?" I asked. Margaret smiled. "How soon do you need to disappear?" We worked out a plan. It took 3 weeks to execute. I opened new accounts at a different bank under the trust Margaret helped me establish. I transferred my pension payments to the new accounts. I listed my house with a realtor in Edmonton who wouldn't know to contact Trevor. I bought a used truck, paid cash, no paper trail. I found a small cabin for sale near Kelowna, BC, 3 hours from Calgary, but a world away from the life I'd been living. 2 bedrooms, wood stove, half an acre with lake access. The seller wanted a quick sale, and my cash offer closed in 10 days. I didn't tell Trevor or Jessica any of this. When they called to ask about the investment deadline, I was vague. Still thinking, I'd say, need a bit more time. Trevor's frustration grew with each call. Jessica stopped being subtle about her contempt. In her last voicemail, she said, "You know what, Robert? Keep your money. We'll figure it out ourselves. But don't expect us to keep bringing the kids around when you've made it clear where your priorities are." That message made the decision easy. I spent my last week in Calgary packing. Not everything, just what mattered. Linda's jewelry and photo albums. The fishing rod she'd given me on our 25th anniversary. Her recipe cards. Emma and Connor's drawings from my refrigerator. I left most of the furniture. Let Trevor sell it when he sold the house. He'd probably need the money after the cryptocurrency scheme fell through. On my last night in Calgary, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote the letter. I explained that I loved him, that I'd always love him, but that I couldn't fund his choices anymore. I explained that the house would be sold and the proceeds would go into a trust that would provide for my living expenses and medical care. I explained that I'd set up education funds for Emma and Connor, $50,000 each, accessible when they turned 18, managed by Margaret at the bank. They'd have money for college. They'd have a start. But they wouldn't have a blank check. I explained that Linda had made me promise not to let them take everything, and I was finally keeping that promise. I explained that I was leaving, and they wouldn't be able to find me. I'd contact them when and if I was ready. Until then, they needed to learn to stand on their own feet. I didn't tell them about the cabin. I didn't tell them about Kelowna. I didn't give them any way to track me down. At 4 a.m, I loaded my truck. I drove to a FedEx office and mailed copies of all their texts and emails to myself at my new address evidence, in case I needed it. Then I drove to my phone provider, canceled my plan, and bought a new phone with a new number. I drove to Trevor's house and taped the envelope to his door. Then I drove west. I watched the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains somewhere past Banff. I stopped for breakfast in Golden and felt lighter than I had in years. By noon, I was crossing into British Columbia. By 3, I was pulling up to the cabin. It was perfect. Small, yes. Old, yes. But the roof was sound, the wood stove worked, and I could see the lake through the trees. I could hear silence, real silence. Not the heavy quiet of grief and loneliness, but the peaceful absence of demands and manipulation and guilt. I unloaded my truck. I set up Linda's urn on the mantel. I hung her apron in the kitchen. I put Emma and Connor's drawings on the refrigerator. Then I sat on the front porch and waited to feel guilty. It never came. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Linda got sick. I felt free. That was 4 months ago. I haven't spoken to Trevor or Jessica since. I know they found the letter because they tried calling my old number dozens of times that first week. Then the calls stopped. Margaret tells me they've been to the bank, demanding access to my accounts, claiming I'm mentally incompetent. She shut them down with documentation of my sound mind and clear instructions. My house sold 3 weeks ago. The proceeds went into the trust, just like I'd planned. Trevor hired a lawyer to contest the sale. The lawyer sent one letter, realized there was no case, and withdrew. I haven't seen Emma or Connor. That's the only part that hurts. I think about them constantly. I wonder if they ask about me, if they miss Sunday pancakes, if they remember the stories I told them about Linda. I've written them letters, dozens of letters, but I haven't sent them. They're too young to understand. Maybe when they're older, when they're 18 and can access their education funds, I'll reach out. I'll explain. I'll hope they understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach someone they can't have everything they demand. I've started fishing again. There's a spot on the lake where the trout gather in the mornings, and I go there with Linda's rod and watch the sun turn the water gold. I talk to her sometimes, out loud, telling her about my day. I think she'd like this place. I think she'd be proud that I finally listened to her. Last week, I met my neighbor, a woman named Ruth, who's about my age. She brought over a casserole and asked if I wanted to join her book club. I said yes. Yesterday, I went to town and signed up for a woodworking class at the community center. I'm learning to build furniture. My first project is a small chest for Emma and Connor, something I can give them someday, when they're old enough to come find me on their own terms. I'm 63 years old, and I'm starting over. I should feel guilty. I should feel like a bad father, a bad grandfather. But every morning, I wake up in this cabin, make coffee, and walk down to the lake, and I feel something I'd forgotten was possible. I feel like myself again. Last night, I had a dream about Linda. We were sitting on this porch together, watching the sunset over the lake. She didn't say anything. She just took my hand and squeezed it the way she used to. And I knew I'd kept my promise. I couldn't save my son from himself. I couldn't save my grandchildren from their parents' choices, but I saved myself. And maybe, someday, When Emma and Connor are old enough to understand that love isn't measured in dollars, they'll find their way here. They'll knock on my door, and I'll make them pancakes, blueberries for Emma, chocolate chips for Connor. I'll tell them stories about their grandmother. I'll teach them to fish. I'll show them what it means to stand on your own feet, to set boundaries, to choose peace over obligation. Until then, I'm here. I'm safe. I'm free. And I'm finally, after 4 years of grief and guilt and manipulation, living the life Linda wanted for me. Not the one Trevor wanted. Not the one Jessica demanded. The one Linda and I dreamed of together, in those quiet moments before cancer stole our time. Sometimes disappearing isn't running away. Sometimes it's running towards something you'd forgotten you deserved. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let yourself be destroyed in the name of family. I'm Robert Chen. I'm 63 years old. I live in a cabin in British Columbia. My son and daughter-in-law tried to take everything from me, so I disappeared without warning, and I've never been happier.